Hello and welcome to this presentation on promising change while yearning for stability, exploring the complicated relationship of quality assurance and time. My name is Vettori and I'm happy to guide you through this presentation. Now, time overall is an interesting phenomenon. We exist in time and time is omnipresent. It's a constant in our lives, but it's also constantly flowing. We are structured by time, we are governed by time, we are living in time, and this holds particularly true for the working part of our lives and the organizations we live in. Overall, two topics seem to be pretty dominant in the everyday discourse, but also in recent research. One of them is acceleration, so the phenomenon, the experience of everything getting faster. And time loss, the phenomenon that we do not have enough time for anything and seem to have less and less. Funnily enough though, time seems to be missing from the QA discourse, at least in most cases. Don't get me wrong, time plays as big a role in QA as in other parts of our world. Evaluation cycles set a pace and rhythm, longitudinal analysis try to understand how things are changing over time, and workload schemes define how much time is allowed for certain tasks. But somehow the temporal dimension of quality assurance is hardly reflected. Time in higher education research is actually pretty much a more recent phenomenon. So academic time, the time academics spend on things, how academic time is actually structured and governed, has only recently gained more scholarly attention. Acceleration is something that has been more prominent on the agenda of researchers and increasingly also of higher education researchers. One of the most prominent researchers there is Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist who wrote several articles and books on the issue, and one of his key theses is that the whole phenomenon of acceleration as we experience it is not so much result of all the technological changes around us, because they would actually give us more time, but a result of increased productivity, and that's something that's also relevant for academics. Other authors have explored the issue of the discovery time versus delivery time, arguing that more and more we spend time in academia, in institutions, focusing on timely delivery, courses to be taught, programs to set up, deadlines to be kept, but the actual time for being creative, exploring something new, discovering something new gets more and more scarce. And last but not least, some other researchers have focused on how indicators are changing over time, and that's something that's pretty relevant for quality assurance as well. In this presentation and in my research, I'm very much deploying a chronopolitical perspective. Now, chronopolitics, following this definition from Ulrike Feld as a working definition, very much refers to the politics of time governing academic knowledge generation, epistemic entities, and academic lives and careers, as well as academic management processes in a more broader sense. So, chronopolitics overall is very much an approach that examines the relationship between politics and time, that's already in the expression, but also with a clear focus on how concepts of time and temporality can affect decision making and can influence institutional structures and processes. One example that is relevant for academic context, for example, is the finding that knowledge production in our current system very often has to be packaged in multi-year units depending on how long the funding goes, how long certain contract goes. So more and more the context is actually defining how much time is there for achieving a certain goal. And as we will see in a minute, that's also something pretty relevant within the QA discourse. In my own research, I'm more and more starting to pay attention to how time and QA are entangled. And it's also something from a professional perspective that's interesting me. So I'm particularly interested in the explicit and implicit concepts of time and change that are embedded in our QA procedures and mechanisms. For example, how do review cycles construct our perceptions of change and improvement? How are data compared from one cycle to the next? What is the conceptual as well as practical relation between repeated measurements and longitudinal observations. So in a way, all those aspects where we focus on cycles, where we see repeated data generation, and where the way we actually embed QA processes also has a big impact on our notions of improvement and the time we spend on it. When it comes to internal quality assurance, as an example, a few observations are already pretty clear that I want to share with you. One of them is the principle of regularity and the powerful pictures of cycles we find in a lot of internal QA frameworks. So we have all these annual surveys of graduates, sometimes annual surveys of students, annual surveys of companies, of other stakeholders, annual reporting, regular course evaluations. So the whole idea in QA, and you also find it up to the European standards and guidelines, seems something about repeating cycles, about a circular approach to things. The big but is, would changes within this logic actually even be observable? How much can change from one year to the next? This whole issue of regularity very often hides or invisibilizes that we cannot actually really see meaningful difference without first defining what is a meaningful gap between 2 points of observation. And why, and I think that's pretty much a pragmatic question as well as a research question, why do improvements actually need to be squeezed into a year? Other examples, the principle of extension. So we very much see that new QA instruments are added to the mix as fashions change. I have hardly encountered a QA framework that has got rid of other instruments. Usually we keep piling them up. This is nothing new, but it also has some profound impact on the time in organizations and the priorities in organizations. So the big but, the question here is, how much time is actually spent on assembling reports, documenting activities, events and processes for the sake of QA? And who is assessing all these processes in terms of the workload and time constraints they are creating? In a way, it's something that has been discussed before, also from the perspective of reluctance of academics towards QA, QA being very much perceived as a bureaucratic experience. But I do believe the temporal dimension has not been covered so far and has gained very, very little. If we move to the EQA perspective, external quality assurance, there are also some things that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. So one example is that quality reviews in almost all external quality assurance frameworks I have so far analyzed and taken a look at are cyclical, and they promise regularity. Again, that leads very much back to the European standards and guidelines that also demand cyclical reviews also from the agencies themselves. Again, there's a but. What we see is that review cycles can differ very much across different agencies, sometimes lasting 3 up to 7 years, but those cycles seem to follow logistical considerations rather than the time budget needed for improvement. So we can see some very adverse effects. If the reviewers come back only after 7 years, that means the scope for an improvement can be far too long for the actual thing at hand. Now, of course, there are a lot of inventions and interventions there. Intermediate reporting, progress reporting, a quick follow-up after that. But it doesn't change the fact that in all our considerations what an improvement is about, we hardly ever in QA seem to reflect how much time is actually necessary for a certain improvement. The time allotted for it always follows the cycle, the logic of the QA cycle, hardly ever the logic of how much time needs to be budgeted in order to make a certain improvement meaningful. And again, I believe this is something that requires a lot more attention. So, summing that up, I believe we have a very, very complicated relationship between change and stability in quality assurance. On the one hand, the processes we're building, the instruments we're building are very much geared towards stability. In every framework you see the promise of more cycles to come, in the same way. There's always an implicit promise that the processes, the data gathering processes need to be kept and will be kept as stable as possible. On the other hand, What QA arguably is about is bringing change into the organizations, is bringing impulses for improvements. And I believe there's a strong tension between this focus on instruments that basically compare data from one year to the next, but not always with adding value or adding meaning to the observation, and with a logic that really focuses on irritating an institution and trying to bring in new impulses. So a big question is how much creativity, how many impulses, how much impetus for change can actually come for us from a system that is very much built like a long-running machine. Well, in a lot of ways, only time will tell if this really brings something about. I think it's also a dimension of the current impact discourse we're experiencing. I'm really looking forward to seeing, or at least hearing and reading some of you in our closing session at this year's online ECAF, and I'm very much interested in exploring the whole issue of quality assurance and time a bit more in depth in the discussion and the debate there. Thank you very much for listening.